Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand battlefields or the monumental achievements, but to the whispers behind closed doors, to the velvet ropes of royal courts where history was made. Yes, but often with a heavy dose of scandalous, perverted, and utterly bizarre behaviour. Imagine yourself there, a fly on the wall in a dimly lit Roman villa, the air thick with the scent of roasted peacock and exotic perfumes. You can almost hear the soft, unsettling hum of 1,000 private conversations, the clinking of goblets, and the uneasy laughter of guests who know they are in the presence of an unstable power. You're about to witness things that will make you squirm, laugh, and probably question everything you thought you knew about the past. It's a journey into the twisted minds and desires of the most powerful people who have ever lived. So vivid you probably won't survive it with your illusions intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our descent into the depths of historical debauchery begins, as so many things do. In ancient Rome with the notorious Emperor Nero. You've heard the name, probably in relation to the Great Fire of Rome and his alleged fiddle playing, but his private life was an entirely different kind of inferno. The man was, to put it mildly, a theatrical train wreck. He saw himself not as a mere ruler, but as a divine artist, a superstar in an imperial toga. His reign was a continuous stage performance, and the Roman elite were his captive, often terrified, audience. He'd put on plays where he was the lead actor, forcing senators to attend for hours, pretending to be a beggar or a blind man. It's a bit like your boss making everyone watch them lip-sync on TikTok for an entire workday. Historians still argue whether Nero's artistic endeavours were a genuine passion or a cynical tool of control, designed to humiliate his powerful rivals by forcing them to applaud his terrible performances. But it was Nero's nocturnal parties, his so-called connuiuia or orgies, that truly earned him his reputation. These weren't just simple dinner parties, they were elaborate, months-long festivals of excess. The food was brought in from all corners of the empire, the wine flowed like a river, and the entertainment was, shall we say, non-traditional. He would allegedly have his guests lie on couches covered in rose petals, and if you fell asleep, you risked being dropped into a large pool of water. It's a bizarre and cruel prank, a far cry from a modern party prank like wrapping someone's car in plastic wrap. You can almost feel the sticky, humid air, the heavy scent of unwashed bodies, wine, and exotic flowers. Nero's personal life was an equally chaotic mess. He married several times, but his most infamous relationships were with men and even an enslaved boy. A fringe tidbit is his purported marriage to a freedman named Pythagoras, in which Nero took on the role of the bride. You're trying to picture that, right? Nero, in a veil, surrounded by stunned courtiers. It's a scene so absurd it feels more like a fever dream than historical fact. He also castrated a young slave boy named Sporus, who he believed resembled his late wife Poppaea, and then married him, dressing him in women's clothes and treating him as his empress. The Roman elite were used to debauchery, but this was a new level of public perversity, even for them. It was a spectacular example of power unchecked, where a man could literally rewrite the social rules of gender and relationships on a whim. This level of self-indulgent depravity wasn't just a personal failing, it was a symptom of a rotten system, a sign that the very foundations of the empire were starting to crumble. From the theatrical and depraved Nero, we slide, almost seamlessly, into the next chapter of Roman madness with Caligula. A man whose reign feels less like a historical period and more like a psychological horror film. You can just feel the air of paranoia clinging to him, the way a bad cologne lingers on an old jacket. Caligula, a name that literally means little boot from his childhood, started his reign with a flash of hope. A brief period where he was hailed as a savior, but that promise quickly soured. It's almost like a celebrity who wins an award and then immediately starts tweeting nonsense. His descent into tyranny was swift and breathtakingly bizarre. The stories are legendary, and for good reason. You're trudging through the palace, trying to keep a low profile, and you witness things that defy all logic, like the time he had a bridge built across a bay just so he could ride his horse across it. Why? apparently to prove a prophecy wrong. It's the kind of over-the-top, expensive pettiness that only a person with unlimited power can afford. But the most famous, and perhaps most telling, example of his eccentric behavior involves his horse, Incitatus. You've probably heard this one, and it's a mainstream historical fact for a reason. Caligula was so infatuated with his horse that he gave it a marble stall, an ivory manger, and even a jeweled collar. But the real kicker, the thing that makes you want to lie down and take a nap just thinking about the absurdity, is that he reportedly planned to make Incitatus a consul. Yes, a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. Now, before you lose your mind entirely, a quirky tidbit. While many historians of the time wrote about this, modern scholars believe it may have been more of a political jab at the Roman Senate than a literal plan. He was essentially telling the senators, "You are so useless, I could replace you with my horse." It was a public and deeply humiliating slap in the face. Historians still argue whether this was pure madness or a cynical power play, but either way, the message was clear: no one was safe. And the line between ruler and raving lunatic was razor thin. It was as if he wanted to make a point that his power was absolute, that he could elevate a creature of instinct and make it superior to the wisest men in the empire. His perversions weren't just about horses, of course. Caligula allegedly had sexual relations with his sisters, paraded them as his wives, and engaged in sadistic games. He was known for forcing senators and their wives to participate in orgies, and then humiliating them afterward by telling everyone the details. He once allegedly said that his greatest joy was watching men suffer. It was a reign of terror fueled by a twisted sense of humor and an insatiable desire to dominate and degrade others. He was an emperor who wanted to be worshipped as a god, but his actions were far from divine. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the way everyone walked on eggshells, wondering if today was the day he would snap and have them executed for a perceived slight. You can imagine the tension, the forced laughter, the nervous glances exchanged as he went on one of his terrifying rants. It was all a grand, horrifying, and incredibly uncomfortable performance, with an audience that was more like a hostage pool. It reminds you that the past, for all its grand monuments and achievements, was also a place where a single person's psychosis could ruin millions of lives. We've spent enough time in the male-dominated, self-destructive palaces of ancient Rome. Now, let's pivot and travel forward in time and eastward in geography, to the glittering, Byzantine world of Constantinople. Here, we encounter a woman who rose from the grimy streets and the raucous world of the Hippodrome to become one of the most powerful empresses in history. Theodora, you're now in a new world, a place of gilded mosaics, high-domed churches, and a constant, low-level thrum of political intrigue. The air is filled with the scent of spices from the Silk Road and the distant cries of the chariot races. Theodora's story is a rags-to-riches tale, but with a scandalous twist that would make a modern tabloid blush. Before she met the future Emperor Justinian, she was not of noble birth. She was, in fact, an actress and a courtesan. This is a mainstream historical fact, but the details are what make her story so fascinating and so salacious. You can't just gloss over them in the Roman and Byzantine world. Actress was often a euphemism for something more. The stage was not a respectable profession. It was often a place for a kind of performance art that bordered on stripping. Or worse, Theodora was known for her comedic and, shall we say, suggestive performances. One particular quirky or fringe tidbit from a contemporary historian, Procopius, details one of her most famous acts. He wrote in his secret history that Theodora would recline on stage and have geese eat barley from her navel. A performance that sounds so utterly bizarre and unhinged, you almost can't believe it's real. Now, you should know that Procopius's account is highly suspect. He was a disgruntled court official who wrote his secret history as a bitter, posthumous tell-all, and many historians still argue whether his lurid descriptions of Theodora were accurate or just the malicious slander of a political enemy. It's an important reminder that history is often written by the victors or, in this case, the very bitter losers. Despite her humble and scandalous beginnings, Theodora was a force to be reckoned with. When she became empress, she was Justinian's equal in every way. She was sharp, politically savvy, and ruthless. Her influence on her husband was immense. During the Nika riots, When a mob almost overthrew the empire, Justinian was ready to flee. It was Theodora who famously stood her ground and convinced him to stay and fight. She reportedly declared, "Royalty is a magnificent burial shroud," a phrase that has echoed through the centuries. She was a woman who had seen the bottom and wasn't afraid to lose it all to keep what she had won. Her past, far from being a liability, had given her a unique understanding of the masses and a hardened resolve. You can almost see her in the palace, a stark contrast to the pampered empresses of other eras. Her past as a performer gave her an understanding of theatrics, of how to command a room. She used her intelligence and her charisma to gain an iron grip on power. She also used her position to enact real, lasting change, including laws that protected women and reformed the legal status of actresses. So, while her early life was undoubtedly one of scandal and perversion, she leveraged that experience to become one of the most formidable and, in many ways, progressive rulers of her time. It's a complex legacy, one that's a lot more than just a goose and some barley. Leaving the mosaics of Byzantium behind, we now glide forward in time and across the Alps to a figure whose name has become synonymous with a particular brand of psychological perversity, the Marquis de Sade. You're not in a palace anymore. Not really. You're in a salon, a drawing room in 18th century France, where the air smells of powder and intrigue. The conversation is witty and sharp. But there's a dark undercurrent, a fascination with transgression that is both intellectual and deeply disturbing. This is the era of the Enlightenment, of reason and science, but also a time when some of its most famous thinkers pushed the boundaries of human behavior to their breaking point. Donatien Alphonse François, the Marquis de Sade, was a nobleman and writer, but his life was an endless series of scandals and imprisonments. A mainstream historical fact is that he was a libertine, a person who disregards accepted moral and sexual codes, and his actions led to him being locked away for much of his life. But it's not just the actions themselves, it's the philosophy he developed to justify them that is truly chilling. He believed that nature itself was cruel and destructive, and that human beings, as part of nature, should embrace their most brutal instincts. He argued that the only true happiness was found in the pursuit of pleasure, no matter the cost to others. His writings, like Justine and 120 Days of Sodom, were filled with graphic descriptions of torture and sexual violence, all in the name of philosophical exploration. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about him. Many of his most notorious escapades involved intricate or theatrical setups. One famous incident, the Marseille affair, involved him luring women into a house with a promise of a party, only to then drug them with a strange, aphrodisiac-laced concoction. The scandal resulted in him being sentenced to death in absentia, a sentence he was only able to avoid because he was already on the run. Historians still argue whether his actions were purely for personal gratification or a twisted form of performance art, a deliberate attempt to shock and provoke a society he saw as hypocritical. Was he simply a monster, or was he a philosopher pushing the limits of his era's social contract? It's a question that has haunted thinkers for centuries. You can almost feel the tension in the room as he, or someone like him, would casually discuss these ideas. Imagine the forced smiles, the uncomfortable silence as he waxes poetic about cruelty as a form of art. It's the kind of conversation that makes you want to slowly back out of the room. His perversions were not just carnal, they were intellectual. He took the concepts of liberty and freedom and twisted them into an argument for utter moral anarchy. He wasn't just a king or an emperor with unchecked power, he was a nobleman with a dangerous, persuasive ideology. He was the dark side of the Enlightenment, a living example of what happens when reason is used to justify the worst of human instincts rather than to curb them. The very word sadism comes from his name, a testament to how profoundly his particular blend of cruelty and philosophy has etched itself into our collective consciousness. His legacy reminds us that perversion isn't just about what you do, but about how you think, and how you justify the things you do to yourself and to the world. From the intellectual darkness of the Marquis de Sade, we cross the English Channel and land squarely in the tumultuous court of King Henry VIII. You are now standing in Tudor England, a world of grand palaces and political intrigue, where a king's desire for a male heir could, and did, change the entire religious and political landscape of a nation. The air feels heavy, not with perfume, but with the weight of expectation and the ever-present fear of the king's temper. Everyone is on edge. and you can sense it in the stiff postures of the courtiers and the nervous glances exchanged when the king's name is mentioned. Henry VIII is, of course, a mainstream historical fact, but his story is so much more than a simple chronology of 6 wives. His perversion wasn't about public orgies or philosophical cruelty. It was a deeply personal, obsessive quest that twisted his entire kingdom around his own desires. His reign was a series of chaotic and often brutal attempts to secure an heir and to satisfy his own ego. It's the kind of ego that could literally break with an entire religious institution just to get a divorce. His quest for a son became a form of perversion, an obsession that led to the beheadings of 2 of his wives, the annulment of 2 others, and the death of 1 in childbirth. The infamous stories of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, in particular, serve as chilling examples of his tyrannical desires. Anne Boleyn, a woman he moved heaven and earth for, was ultimately executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest when she failed to produce a male heir. Historians still argue whether the charges were a flimsy excuse or if there was any truth to them, but the result was the same. Her death was a brutal display of a king's will, a warning to anyone who might fail to live up to his expectations. You can almost feel the chill as you imagine the final moments of Anne, a woman who had once captivated the king, now facing an executioner's sword. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the sheer audacity of Henry's pursuit of Anne Boleyn. He spent years trying to get a papal annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a process that created a schism in the Catholic Church. While this is a well-known fact, the sheer length and political maneuvering involved are staggering. Henry sent a team of diplomats and scholars across Europe to find any reason, any loophole, to justify the divorce. It's a bit like someone dedicating their entire life to finding a legal reason to break a contract they signed in a moment of passion. His final marriage, to Catherine Parr, was a stark contrast to the others. She was more of a companion and a nurse to the increasingly frail and morbidly obese king. But even this relationship was tinged with danger. She was almost executed for her religious beliefs, saved only by her quick wit and careful flattery of the king. Henry's perversion was his entitlement, his belief that he could bend the laws of God and man to his will. His absolute power transformed his personal desires into a force of national destruction. His legacy is a haunting reminder that a monarch's private life can have devastating public consequences. From the tempestuous reign of Henry VIII, we sail across the sea once more, this time to the lavish court of Louis XV of France. You are now in the heart of the Age of Enlightenment, where powdered wigs and silk brocades are the uniform of the day. But underneath the finery, a different kind of darkness lurks. The air in the Palace of Versailles is thick with the scent of opulence and decay. Louis XV, the great-grandson of the Sun King, inherited a kingdom and a reputation for unparalleled luxury, but his personal life, a mainstream historical fact, was anything but a fairy tale. Louis XV was a king who preferred his personal pleasures to the burdens of state. While he was married to Queen Marie Leszczyńska, his reign is defined by his many mistresses. This, in and of itself, was not new for a French monarch, but the way Louis XV conducted his affairs was unique and particularly sordid. He didn't just have mistresses, he had a system. The most notorious part of this system was his private brothel, a lavish estate known as the Parc aux Cerfs, or Deer Park. It was located in Versailles itself, a secret sanctuary for the king's illicit desires. The Deer Park was not a den of prostitutes in the traditional sense. It was a place where young girls, often barely out of their childhood, were housed and educated with the specific purpose of becoming the king's sexual partners. The most famous of these was an Irish girl named Louise O'Murphy, who was only about 14 years old when she became Louis's mistress. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Parc aux Cerfs was managed with an almost bureaucratic efficiency. As if it were a minor state department, the royal staff kept meticulous records, and the girls were given a small pension when the king was finished with them, a kind of severance package for a very specific type of service. Historians still argue whether the king was a sociopathic pervert or simply a product of a court where a monarch's every whim was indulged without question. Was he actively cruel, or was he so isolated by his power that he simply never developed a sense of empathy? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Deer Park was an example of absolute power corrupting absolutely, a place where a king's basest desires were transformed into a matter of state. where young lives were treated as disposable playthings. You can almost feel the chilling silence of the place, a stark contrast to the lively, public affairs of the court. The Parc aux Cerfs was a secret garden, but one filled with sorrow and exploitation. His reign, for all its splendor, ended in disaster. The king's profligate spending and his indifference to the plight of his people contributed to the unrest that would eventually boil over into the French Revolution. His private vices, like those of so many rulers before him, had profound public consequences. The Deer Park was not just a place of perversion, it was a symbol of a monarchy that had lost its way, a sign that the rot had set in long before the guillotine was ever invented. You get the sense that the palace, with all its grandeur, was simply a gilded cage for a king who didn't know how to be a man, let alone a ruler. From the secret gardens of Versailles, we now pivot northeast to the vast, cold expanse of Russia, and the court of the formidable Catherine the Great. You are no longer in a world of powdered wigs and lace, but in a place of heavy brocades and the stark grandeur of St. Petersburg. The air here is sharp and cold, a contrast to the fiery passions that burned within the Empress, Catherine's reign. A mainstream historical fact was one of immense power and intellectual vigor, but her private life was a series of relationships that were just as strategic as her political maneuvers. Catherine's perversion, if you can call it that, wasn't about cruelty or bizarre public displays. It was about a calculated, almost industrial-scale approach to her love life. She had a long list of favourites, a term that delicately described her lovers. These men were often young, handsome, and ambitious, and she used them not just for pleasure, but as a way to control and reward her court. It was a well-oiled system. A favourite would be given land, titles, and immense wealth, and when the relationship ran its course, they would be dismissed with a generous pension and a new estate. It's a bit like a modern CEO giving a massive golden parachute to an employee they're letting go. One of the more quirky or fringe tidbits about Catherine is the rumour that her favourites were first tested for their abilities by one of her ladies-in-waiting, a kind of pre-interview screening process. This story, while almost certainly apocryphal and a reflection of the gossip that surrounded her, highlights the almost bureaucratic nature of her love life. The idea of a formal vetting process for a romantic partner is so absurd it's almost laughable, but it speaks to a very real sense of control and power that Catherine wielded over every aspect of her life, including the most intimate. Historians still argue whether her many lovers were a sign of a deep, emotional need for connection or a cynical display of power, a way to show that she, a woman, had the same sexual freedom and privilege as any male monarch. Her most famous lover, Grigory Potemkin, was more than just a favourite. He was her political partner and confidant. Their relationship was a tumultuous blend of love and power, and he remained a key figure in her court even after their romantic entanglement ended. You can almost imagine the hushed conversations and the jealous whispers as a new favourite would be announced, knowing that their rise to power was entirely dependent on their ability to please the Empress. Catherine's life reminds you that power and perversion are not always about sadism or public scandal. Sometimes, it's about a cold, rational system of exploitation, where people are used as pawns in a grand game. For Catherine, her lovers were not just men, they were tools, a means to an end. Her legacy is a complex tapestry of enlightened rule and personal excess, a testament to a woman who refused to be constrained by the gender expectations of her time, even if it meant treating the men in her life like a revolving door of political appointments. Her reign was a dazzling performance of power, and her love life was an integral part of the show. From the calculated passions of Catherine the Great, we now return to France, but to a different era entirely. We arrive at the opulent and doomed court of Marie Antoinette, a name forever linked to the extravagance that preceded the French Revolution. You're now in the final decades of the 18th century, and the air is no longer filled with the sharp wit of the Enlightenment salons, but with a growing sense of popular discontent. The whispers are no longer about a king's private affairs, but about a queen's public image, and how she embodies everything wrong with the monarchy. Marie Antoinette is a mainstream historical fact, a queen who has been immortalized in books and films for her famous and probably apocryphal quote, "Let them eat cake." But her perversion wasn't a matter of sexual scandal, it was a perversion of her royal duty. Her obsession with fashion, gambling, and lavish parties was seen by the starving masses as an affront, a sign that she was utterly indifferent to their suffering. Her perversion was a kind of moral and social blindness, an inability to see beyond the gilded walls of Versailles. The most famous scandal that cemented her reputation was the diamond necklace affair. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit because it wasn't a scandal she was directly involved in. The affair was a complex con job orchestrated by a con artist named Jean de Valois Saint-Remy. Jean convinced a cardinal, Louis de Rohan, that he could win the Queen's favour by buying her a fantastically expensive diamond necklace. The cardinal, desperate to regain influence, agreed. The swindlers then stole the necklace, and when the whole thing unravelled, the public believed the Queen was complicit. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette's reputation for profligacy was a fair assessment or a deliberate smear campaign by her enemies. Was she a spendthrift fool, or was she simply a convenient scapegoat for the monarchy's systemic failures? The truth is, the scandal didn't need to be true to be effective. It confirmed the public's worst suspicions about their queen. The necklace itself, a glittering, absurdly expensive piece of jewellery, became a symbol of a monarchy that had lost all touch with reality. You can almost feel the outrage building, a slow, simmering anger that would eventually explode. The public didn't just hate her for her extravagance, they saw her as foreign, frivolous, and dangerous. They accused her of everything from gambling away the kingdom's treasury to engaging in inappropriate relationships with both men and women. The diamond necklace affair was just the final nail in a coffin that had been a long time in the making. It was a story that combined the two things the public hated most: her perceived extravagance and the sheer absurdity of the court's inner workings. Her perversion was not in a private vice, but in a public one, a public display of wealth that was profoundly out of sync with the suffering of her people. It was a failure of empathy, a fatal flaw that would, in the end, lead her to the guillotine. From the political storms of pre-revolutionary France, we journey now to the tranquil, snow-dusted mountains of Bavaria and into the ethereal world of King Ludwig II. You are no longer in the gilded halls of a palace filled with intrigue, but in a place of theatrical solitude. The air is crisp and clean, but there's a profound melancholy that hangs over everything, a quiet sadness that feels as cold as the alpine winds. Ludwig II is a mainstream historical fact, the fairy tale king who built the magnificent Neuschwanstein castle, a place so famous it inspired the Disney logo. But his perversion was not a matter of public scandal or sexual debauchery, it was a perversion of reality itself. Ludwig was a monarch who found the realities of governance and politics unbearable. He preferred to live in a world of his own creation, one populated by the heroes of German mythology and the romantic operas of Richard Wagner. An obsession he had from a young age. He spent immense sums of his royal treasury not on his people, but on his fantastical architectural projects. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee were not just buildings, they were physical manifestations of his inner world, a grand stage where he could play out his fantasies. It's the kind of project that makes you think, man, this guy really wanted to live in a movie. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Ludwig was so devoted to his imagined world that he had a grotto built inside Linderhof Palace, complete with a gilded boat and an artificial waterfall. He would even have himself rowed across the grotto's lake while listening to an opera singer perform. This was not a public display, it was a private ritual, a testament to his profound detachment from the real world. Historians still argue whether Ludwig was truly mad as his family and ministers claimed, or if he was simply a deeply eccentric recluse who was ill-suited for the burdens of royalty. Was his obsession a form of mental illness, or was it a deliberate escape from a world he found too coarse and too ugly? The debate continues. Ludwig's perversion was his refusal to engage with his duty as a king. He retreated from his public responsibilities, becoming a night creature who would only travel under the cover of darkness to inspect his construction projects. He would have elaborate dinners served for a single person at a table set for 4, with imaginary guests like Marie Antoinette and Louis XV. Remember Louis XV and his private deer park? Ludwig was almost the opposite. He was seeking a private solitude, a world entirely divorced from human contact. He wasn't a pervert in the traditional sense, but his utter self-absorption and his retreat from reality were a different kind of moral failing. He spent the people's money on his private dreams, a profoundly selfish act that ultimately led to his downfall. He was declared insane by his own ministers and deposed, dying a mysterious death in a lake just a few days later. His legacy is a series of stunning castles, but they are also a monument to a king who was lost in his own mind. From the introspective but isolated world of Ludwig II, we now travel south to the Iberian Peninsula and the court of Ferdinand VII of Spain. You are now in the early 19th century, in a kingdom reeling from the Napoleonic Wars and the rise of a new liberal ideology. The air is heavy with the scent of political repression and a quiet, simmering fear. Ferdinand VII is a mainstream historical fact, a king who was hated by liberals and beloved by reactionaries, a man who saw himself as a divinely appointed monarch and who believed in absolute rule. But his perversions were not in the public sphere, they were locked away in the most private rooms of the royal palace. Ferdinand's perversion was a strange mix of cruelty and an almost voyeuristic fascination with the grotesque. He had a morbid sense of humour and a love for the theatrical, but his stage was a secret one. He was known for his private rooms where he would conduct bizarre, sadistic rituals and indulge in strange fetishes. One of his more notorious practices was his fascination with public humiliation and punishment. He enjoyed watching people be flogged, and he would often stage these events for his own amusement. It was a kind of a sick and twisted theatre, a way for him to feel his power in the most direct and brutal way possible. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Ferdinand had a hidden room in the palace where he kept a collection of mechanical dolls and figurines. This is an odd detail, a bizarre juxtaposition of childish fascination and a sadistic streak while he was out in public, ordering the execution of political opponents and re-establishing the Spanish Inquisition. He would privately retreat to a room filled with toys. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of a deeply troubled mind, a childlike innocence corrupted by absolute power, or simply another expression of his macabre and theatrical personality. Was he a monster, or just a boy who never grew up, given unlimited power and the freedom to indulge in his darkest desires? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the chill as you imagine walking past these secret rooms, knowing what went on behind those closed doors. The opulent, grand halls of the palace hid a dark underbelly, a place where the king's private depravity played out. The contrast between his public image as a pious, traditional monarch and his secret life was stark. His perversions were not just about sex or power, they were about a deep-seated psychological darkness. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but his true character was revealed in his private chambers, where he could indulge in the kinds of cruelties that were too bizarre even for the public stage. He was a tyrant who loved to watch people suffer, a fact that makes his reign all the more unsettling. From the dark, secretive palace of Ferdinand VII, we now cross the European continent to Sweden and the dramatic court of Queen Christina. You are in the mid-17th century, a time of religious fervour and political upheaval, and you are standing in a court that is a hub of intellectual life, a northern Athens. The air is cold and crisp, but the minds here are hot with debate. Christina is a mainstream historical fact, the brilliant and unconventional daughter of the great King Gustavus Adolphus, but her perversion was not in her private life, so much as in her very public rejection of it, and of her most sacred duty as a monarch. Christina's reign was marked by her brilliance and her eccentricity. She was a polymath who spoke several languages, a patron of the arts, and a keen student of philosophy and science. But she was also a woman who refused to conform to the expectations of her time. She dressed in men's clothes, walked with a masculine swagger, and rejected the idea of marriage. Seeing it as a form of subjugation, her perversion was her refusal to play the part of a queen, a role that was so integral to the stability of the Swedish crown. She was meant to produce an heir, to ensure the continuity of the royal line, but she had no interest in doing so. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Christina had a deep and possibly romantic relationship with her female courtier, Ebba Spar, whom she called La Belle Comtesse, the beautiful countess. While some historians argue their relationship was purely platonic, others point to the passionate letters they exchanged as evidence of a deeper bond. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was Christina a lesbian, a woman who simply rejected the norms of her time, or was her behaviour a kind of political statement, a rejection of the traditional roles assigned to women in power? The debate is ongoing. Her ultimate act of rebellion, and the one that cemented her legacy, was her abdication of the throne. At the age of just 28, she gave up the Swedish crown, left her country, and converted to Catholicism. Remember what Theodora said about royalty being a magnificent burial shroud? Christina was having none of it. She wanted to be free. She travelled to Rome, where she was welcomed as a celebrity, a queen who had sacrificed everything for her faith and her freedom. She spent the rest of her life there, a patron of the arts and a fixture of the city's intellectual salons. You can almost feel the shock of her court as she announced her decision. It was an act of utter self-interest, a profound perversion of her royal duty. She put her personal desires, her freedom, her intellectual pursuits, her faith, above the needs of her kingdom. She was a queen who was not in a prison, but she chose to break out anyway. She was a pervert, not of body, but of spirit. A woman who refused to be defined by her role and who, in the end, chose a life of scandal and freedom over a life of duty and a crown. From the dramatic abdication of Queen Christina, we journey back east to the turbulent political world of 18th century Poland and the court of Stanisław August Poniatowski. You are in a different world now, one where a king is not an absolute ruler, but a pawn in the great game of European power politics. The air here is charged with a quiet anxiety, the scent of a nation on the brink of being torn apart by its powerful neighbours. Stanisław August is a mainstream historical fact, the last king of an independent Poland, but his perversion was a kind of political and personal weakness, a fatal flaw that made him a puppet of the very woman we've already discussed, Catherine the Great of Russia. Stanisław August's story is a tragic love affair with a political twist. Before he was king, he was one of Catherine the Great's many lovers. She saw in him a potential tool, a man she could put on the Polish throne and control. She helped him get elected king, and for a time, he was exactly what she wanted, a loyal, compliant ruler. His perversion, then, was his inability to separate his personal feelings for Catherine from his duty to his country. He was, in a sense, a victim of his own ambition and his relationship with a powerful, manipulative woman. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Stanisław August was a patron of the arts and a lover of science and architecture, a kind of Polish version of the Enlightenment monarchs. He built beautiful palaces and supported intellectual pursuits, but all of this was done under the watchful eye of his Russian masters. It's a bit like a person who is a brilliant artist but who can only paint what their overbearing patron tells them to. Historians still argue whether Stanisław was a well-meaning king who was simply out of his depth, or if his personal weaknesses were a primary cause of Poland's ultimate destruction. Was he a tragic figure, or a complicit enabler of his country's downfall? It's a question that still divides scholars. His court was a hotbed of intrigue and gossip. With his love affairs often intertwined with political manoeuvring, he had numerous mistresses and a number of illegitimate children, but all of this was happening against the backdrop of a nation being carved up by its neighbours, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. His personal life was a distraction from the real tragedy unfolding around him. You can almost feel the frustration of the Polish patriots, watching their king spend his time on mistresses and grand architectural projects while their nation was being slowly, methodically devoured. The perversion of Stanisław August was a perversion of a king's duty. He was supposed to be the protector of his country, but instead, he was the puppet of its enemy. His personal life, far from being a private matter, was a political weapon used against him and his kingdom. He was a man who seemed more concerned with his place in history as a man of letters and a lover of art than he was with the very real and very existential threat to his nation. It's a testament to how personal weaknesses, when combined with absolute power, can have devastating global consequences. From the tragic figure of Poland's last king, we now shift to the small but influential kingdom of the Netherlands and the secretive life of King William II. You are in the early 19th century, a time when old monarchies were clashing with new ideas of liberalism and nationalism. The air in the royal palace feels formal and a bit stuffy, but underneath the surface, there's a quiet tension, a sense of secrets waiting to be exposed. William II is a mainstream historical fact, known for his role in the Battle of Waterloo and his brief reign as a constitutional monarch, but his perversion was a kind of private, secret life, a contrast to his public image as a military hero and a family man. William II was married to Anna Pavlovna, a Russian Grand Duchess and sister of Tsar Alexander I. They had a number of children and seemed, on the surface, to be a solid royal couple, but behind the closed doors of the palace, William led a different kind of life. There were rumours of his bisexuality, a fact that was a scandal in the rigid, conservative society of the 19th century. His perversion, Then was his hidden identity, his need to live a double life to maintain his position and his family's reputation. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the story of the Moustache Club, a group of men who were rumoured to be the king's close confidants and lovers. The name was a kind of a running joke, a way to refer to the group without being explicit. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was the Moustache Club a real thing, a secret gay circle within the royal court? Or was it just a malicious rumour spread by William's political enemies? The lack of definitive evidence makes it hard to say for sure, but the very existence of the story speaks to a certain truth about the king's reputation. It suggests that his sexuality was an open secret, a quiet whisper that everyone in the court knew but dared not speak about in public. You can almost feel the stifling formality of the court, the forced smiles and the averted gazes, as the courtiers tried to navigate the delicate web of royal secrets. The king's private life was a kind of minefield, where one wrong word could lead to social ruin. His perversion was not in the public display of vice, but in the very private act of concealment, of having to hide a fundamental part of who he was. His reign was a brief one, and the scandals of his private life were largely buried by the more pressing political events of his time. But they are a reminder that even in the most buttoned-up royal courts, human desires and identities find a way to exist, even if they have to be hidden in the shadows. He was a king who had to live two lives, a public one of duty and a private one of desire, a dichotomy that must have been a constant source of tension and stress. It's a sad story, really, of a man who could not be himself in the world he was born to rule. From the secretive court of the Netherlands, we move east to the austere, militaristic court of Frederick the Great of Prussia. You are now in the mid-18th century, a time of grand political strategy and brutal warfare. The air here is sharp, cold, and smells of discipline and pipe smoke. Frederick is a mainstream historical fact, the legendary military genius who transformed Prussia into a European power. But his perversion was not a matter of public scandal. It was a quiet, private life that stood in stark contrast to his public image as a warrior king. Frederick was married to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Bevern, a political marriage he made no secret of his disdain for. He lived a life of celibacy with her, and they were, for all intents and purposes, a royal couple in name only. His perversion was a refusal to engage in the kind of traditional, dynastic relationships expected of a monarch. Instead, he preferred the company of men, a fact that was an open secret in his court. His private life was centered around a small circle of male confidants and friends. He lived a bachelor's life at his beloved summer palace, Sanssouci, a place he designed as a refuge from the pressures of court and politics. He filled it with books, music, and the company of his dogs and his male friends. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Frederick was a devoted flutist and a composer, and he would often play concerts for his private circle. It's a bit like a modern military leader who spends his free time as a professional musician, a stark contrast to his public persona. Historians still argue whether Frederick was a homosexual, a bisexual, or simply an asexual man who found comfort in the company of other men. The lack of explicit evidence from the time, combined with a cultural reluctance to discuss such topics, makes it difficult to say for sure. Was his preference for male company a reflection of his sexual orientation, or was it a rejection of the traditional roles and expectations of a king, a desire for intellectual companionship over romantic entanglements? The debate continues. You can almost feel the quiet, intellectual tension of the gatherings at Sanssouci, a place where the king could drop his guard and be himself. A stark contrast to the rigid formality of his public court. Frederick's perversion, if we can call it that, was his utter disregard for the traditional expectations of a male ruler. He refused to be a husband and a father in the traditional sense, and he prioritized his intellectual and personal relationships over the dynastic needs of his kingdom. He was a great general and a brilliant statesman, but his private life was a kind of a quiet rebellion, a statement that he would be his own man, regardless of the expectations of his family or his subjects. His legacy is one of military brilliance and enlightened rule, but it is also one of profound personal solitude, a life lived on his own terms, and one that remains a source of fascination and debate to this day. From the quiet, intellectual court of Frederick the Great we now cross to England, a country we've visited before, but in a different era. We land in the early 17th century, in the court of King James the first Stuart King of England. You are in a different kind of palace now, one of dark wood and heavy tapestries, where the air is thick with religious and political tension. James I is a mainstream historical fact, the king who commissioned the King James Bible and united the crowns of England and Scotland. But his perversion was a kind of public favoritism and a passionate attachment to men, a fact that was a source of scandal and political strife throughout his reign. James was openly affectionate with his male courtiers, a practice that was a stark contrast to the expected decorum of a king. While there is no definitive proof of physical intimacy, the language he used in his letters to his male favourites was often so effusive and romantic that it has been a source of fascination for centuries. His most famous favourite, a man named George Villiers, who he created the Duke of Buckingham, was a particular point of contention. The king showered him with titles, riches, and power, a fact that angered the traditional English nobility and parliament. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this relationship is the sheer audacity of James's public displays of affection. He would often refer to Villiers as his sweet child and my sweet and dear child, and in one famous letter he wrote, "I desire to live no longer than I may be a lover of you." Historians still argue whether James's relationships with his male favourites were a reflection of his homosexuality or a kind of platonic, almost paternal love for his young charges. The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the language of love and affection was different in the 17th century than it is today. Was he a homosexual king, or was he just a man who expressed his emotions in a way that seems strange to our modern sensibilities? You can almost feel the tension in the room as you watch the king dote on his favourite, a young man who was, by all accounts, incredibly handsome and charming. The courtiers would have been forced to stand by and watch as this upstart gained power and influence purely because of his relationship with the king. James's perversion was not a private vice, it was a public one. His personal affections bled into his political decisions, and he often elevated men of little talent to positions of immense power, purely because of his personal feelings for them. This was a perversion of the very idea of meritocracy and good governance. He was a king who could not separate his heart from his duties, a fatal flaw that would, in the end, lead to a political crisis that would culminate in the English Civil War. His legacy is one of religious and intellectual achievement, but it is also a story of a king whose personal life was a constant source of scandal and political instability. From the scandalous court of James I, we now travel to 19th century Spain and the tumultuous reign of Isabella II. You're back in the grand, but deeply troubled, court of the Spanish monarchy, a place where the scent of political unrest hangs in the air like a thick fog. Isabella II is a mainstream historical fact, the queen who was put on the throne as a child and whose reign was marked by a seemingly endless series of civil wars, political coups, and a personal life that was a constant source of scandal. Isabella's perversion wasn't a single act of cruelty or a hidden vice. It was a kind of open, public chaos. Her many love affairs were not discreet or private. They were a well-known fact of court life, a source of constant gossip and political manoeuvring. She was married to her cousin, Francis, a man she allegedly found repulsive. This loveless marriage, a political necessity, led her to seek solace and passion in the arms of a string of lovers, both male and female. Her chaotic personal life, then, was a kind of a rebellion against a life that had been chosen for her. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Isabella was rumoured to have had a number of female lovers, including a countess and a marchioness. While this is a fact that historians still argue about, the very existence of these rumours speaks to her reputation for unconventional and often scandalous relationships. Was she a bisexual queen, or were the rumours of her female lovers simply the slander of her political enemies? The debate continues. You can almost feel the breathless gossip of the court, the way everyone would have been watching her every move, trying to discern the identity of her latest paramour. Her reign was a disaster, and her personal life was at the heart of it. Her political decisions were often influenced by her lovers, and her indecisiveness and frequent changes of government led to a period of instability that was a prelude to a revolution. Her perversion was a kind of public exhibitionism, an inability to separate her personal desires from her public duty. She was a queen who seemed more interested in her own passions than in the well-being of her kingdom. She was, in a sense, a perversion of a queen, a woman who had the power of a monarch but none of the restraint or sense of duty that the position required. She was a kind of a force of nature, a woman who lived with a wild abandon that was both fascinating and ultimately destructive to her rule. Her legacy is one of political failure and personal scandal, a reign that was defined by a kind of moral and political anarchy. From the chaotic court of Isabella II, we now sail north once more to England and the reign of Charles II. You're in the mid-17th century, and the air feels celebratory and a little bit scandalous. After the years of puritanical rule under Oliver Cromwell, the Restoration brought a wave of hedonism and a king who embodied the new spirit. Charles II is a mainstream historical fact. The merry monarch who brought back the monarchy and presided over a court known for its lavish parties, public theatre, and general sense of debauchery. Charles's perversion wasn't about hidden vices or intellectual darkness. It was a kind of open, public display of a monarch's sexual freedom. He had a great many mistresses, a fact that was not only well known but was almost a point of pride. He had numerous illegitimate children, and he was quite open about them, even giving them titles and pensions. This was a stark contrast to the discreet affairs of earlier monarchs. His perversion was a kind of exhibitionism, a public declaration that he was not bound by the same moral codes as his subjects. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that his most famous mistress, Nell Gwynn, was a former orange seller and actress. She was a woman from humble beginnings who became a powerful and influential figure at court, a testament to Charles's disregard for class distinctions when it came to his passions. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was Charles's relationship with Nell a sign of a truly egalitarian spirit? Or was it just another way for him to defy the norms of the traditional aristocracy? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the festive, scandalous atmosphere of the court, the way everyone would have been watching to see who the king's latest favourite was. The king's affairs were not just a private matter, they were a part of the political landscape. His mistresses often vied for influence and power, and they were a source of great wealth and patronage for their families. Charles's perversion was a public one, and it was a form of political theatre. He was a king who ruled not just with an iron fist, but with a kind of charming, roguish libertinism that made him popular with the masses, but a source of frustration for his more conservative ministers. His legacy is one of political stability after years of civil war, but it is also one of public, unapologetic debauchery, a kind of a royal party that seemed to last his entire reign. He was a king who ruled with a smile and a wink, and who, in the process, redefined what it meant to be a monarch. From the Restoration court of Charles II, we now jump back across the Channel to France. To the late 16th century and the reign of Henry III, you are in a different France, one torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. The air is tense and dangerous, and the scent of betrayal is everywhere. Henry III is a mainstream historical fact, the last Valois king of France, but his perversion was a kind of open, public effeminacy that was a source of great scandal and political derision. Henry was a man who seemed to defy the expectations of his time. He was an intellectual and a patron of the arts, but he was also known for his elaborate, often theatrical, sense of style. He would wear heavy makeup, earrings, and women's clothing, and he surrounded himself with a group of young, handsome male courtiers known as his mignons, a term that can be translated as darlings or favourites. His perversion was a kind of a public and gender-bending display, a refusal to conform to the masculine ideal of a warrior king. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that his mignons were known for their outlandish and effeminate fashion, which included elaborate lace collars, curled hair, and heavily starched ruffs. They would often be involved in duels and brawls with their political rivals, a bizarre juxtaposition of their delicate fashion and their violent, masculine behaviour. This is a point that historians still argue about. Were Henry III and his mignons a group of homosexuals, or were they simply a group of young men who were rebelling against the rigid social norms of their time? The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the word mignon was often used by his enemies as a slur. You can almost feel the contempt of the French public and the nobility, watching their king dress in women's clothes and surround himself with these effeminate young men. They saw it as a sign of weakness, a perversion of a king's duty to be a strong, masculine leader. His political enemies used his personal life as a weapon against him, accusing him of debauchery and of a kind of moral weakness that was supposedly responsible for the nation's political and religious strife. He was a king who was hated by the Catholic League for being too moderate, and by the Protestants for being a Catholic. His personal life, far from being a private matter, was a public spectacle and a political liability. He was a kind of a living paradox, a king who was a fierce warrior in battle, but who, in his private life, seemed to deliberately defy every expectation of what a king should be. His legacy is one of political failure and personal scandal, a reign that was defined by a kind of theatrical and gender-bending perversion. From the tumultuous religious wars of 16th century France, we now make a sharp turn to the heart of the Catholic world, the Vatican. You are now in late 15th century Rome, a place of immense political power and spiritual authority, but also one of profound corruption and moral decay. The air here is thick with the scent of incense and the stink of backroom deals. Our subject is Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, and his infamous Borgia family. He is a mainstream historical fact, but his perversion was a kind of open, unapologetic corruption of his sacred office. The Catholic Church, at the time, was not just a spiritual institution, it was a political and economic powerhouse, and the papacy was an office of immense power. Alexander VI's perversion was his complete and utter disregard for the vows of celibacy and his open promotion of his illegitimate children. He had 4 children by his longtime mistress, Vannozza de Catanei, including the famous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. His perversion was not a private vice, it was a public one, a kind of grand, theatrical display of a pope's family life. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the story of the Banquet of Chestnuts, an alleged orgy held at the Apostolic Palace. The story, recounted by a contemporary diarist, details a dinner party where 50 prostitutes were present, and they engaged in a sexual free-for-all with the male guests, all while the Pope and his children watched. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was the Banquet of Chestnuts a real event, or was it a piece of anti-Borgia propaganda designed to demonize the family and the Pope? The lack of definitive proof makes it hard to say, but the very existence of the story speaks to the reputation of the Borgias as a family of unparalleled debauchery. You can almost feel the shock and outrage of the Roman public and the European monarchs, watching a pope openly live a secular life of power, wealth, and carnal indulgence. His son, Cesare, was a ruthless military commander, and his daughter, Lucrezia, was married and divorced for political gain. The Borgias were a kind of mafia family in sacred robes, and their perversion was not just in their personal lives, but in their corruption of the very institution of the papacy. They used the Church's spiritual authority to further their own political ambitions, a perversion of a religious office that would, in the end, lead to the Protestant Reformation. His legacy is one of political cunning and familial debauchery, a papacy that was a testament to how absolute power, even spiritual power, can corrupt absolutely. He was a pope who was more concerned with the fortunes of his family than with the salvation of souls, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion, from the corrupt papacy of the Borgias. We now travel north to the small but influential kingdom of Denmark and the court of Christian VII. You are now in the late 18th century, and the air here is a strange mix of intellectual enlightenment and royal chaos. Christian VII is a mainstream historical fact, but his perversion was not a matter of carnal vice, it was a perversion of a king's mind. He suffered from a severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and his erratic and often bizarre behaviour led to a political crisis that was more theatrical than any of the dramas we've seen so far. Christian's reign was a disaster from the start. His mental state made him utterly incapable of ruling, and his perversion was his profound psychological detachment from reality. He would have public fits, engage in bizarre self-mutilation, and run naked through the streets of Copenhagen. He was, in a sense, a perversion of a king, a man who had the title but none of the mental faculties required to govern. The story gets even more complicated and scandalous with the arrival of his German doctor, Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee, a kind of celebrity physician and an enlightened thinker, was brought to the court to treat the king. He quickly gained the king's trust and, more importantly, the Queens Struensee and Queen Caroline Matilda, the king's young and unhappy wife, began a scandalous affair that became an open secret at court. Struensee, using his influence over the king, took over the government and enacted a series of sweeping liberal reforms, including the abolition of torture, the reform of the legal system, and the freeing of the serfs. He was, in a sense, a king in all but name. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Struensee's reforms were implemented with the king's signature, a signature that the doctor would forge or get the king to sign in one of his lucid moments. It was a kind of a grand, enlightened, but ultimately illegal, power grab. Historians still argue whether Struensee was a cynical opportunist who used the king's madness for his own gain, or a true reformer who saw an opportunity to bring a backward kingdom into the modern world. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the tension in the room as the doctor and the queen ruled the country while the king was lost in his own mind. The perversion of this reign was the use of a king as a puppet, an empty vessel whose signature could be used to justify a political revolution. The story ended in tragedy, as it so often does. The royal court and the Danish nobility, resentful of the reforms and the German doctor's power, orchestrated a coup. Struensee was arrested, tried, and brutally executed, and the queen was exiled. The king, in his madness, was likely unaware of the full extent of the drama. It was a story of a kingdom ruled by a lover, a doctor, and a mad king, a testament to how power, perversion, and mental illness can create a historical drama unlike any other. From the mad court of Christian VII, we travel across the Atlantic to the newly independent empire of Brazil and the reign of Pedro I. You are in the early 19th century, a world of tropical heat and political revolution. The air is thick with the scent of coffee and the humid warmth of a newly forged nation. Pedro I is a mainstream historical fact. The man who declared Brazil's independence from Portugal and became its first emperor. But his perversion was not in his rule so much as in his personal life. A macabre and obsessive love story that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Pedro was married to Archduchess Maria Leopoldina of Austria, a woman who, by all accounts, was a kind and intelligent queen. But Pedro was a man of fierce passions and a great many mistresses. His most famous, and most tragic, love affair was with a woman named Domitila de Castro, who he made the Marchioness of Santos. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit. She was a fiery, ambitious woman who had a great deal of influence over the emperor. Their relationship was not discreet. It was a public scandal that angered the court and the public. You can almost feel the whispers and the disapproval as the empress was shunted aside for this upstart mistress. But the real perversion of this story is not in the affair itself, but in a macabre twist. Pedro had a deep, obsessive, and ultimately destructive love for another woman, Inés de Castro. But Inés was not alive. She was a historical figure from 14th century Portugal who had been murdered for her love of a king. Pedro was so obsessed with this historical love story that he named his mistress's illegitimate daughter after her. He would often speak of Inés as if she were a living person, and he even had a bust of her made and placed it in his palace. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of a profound psychological instability or a kind of a romantic obsession that bordered on the grotesque. Was he a man lost in a romantic fantasy? Or was he just a pervert with a bizarre and morbid fascination with a historical tragedy? The debate is ongoing. His perversion was a kind of a psychological theatre, a reenactment of a tragic love story in his own life. His obsession with the dead queen and his public affair with his living mistress were a source of constant political and social friction. His reign was short, and his personal scandals were a major factor in his eventual abdication. He was a man who seemed to be living in a world of his own creation, a romantic tragedy where he was the star. His love life, far from being a private matter, was a public spectacle and a source of national shame. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. His legacy is one of political achievement and personal tragedy, a story of a man who could not separate his duty from his strange and obsessive desires. From the tragic, macabre love story of Pedro I, we journey north again, returning to Scandinavia and the theatrical court of Gustav III of Sweden. You are in the late 18th century, a time of intellectual ferment and political intrigue. and the air here is a strange mix of high culture and low politics. Gustav III is a mainstream historical fact, an enlightened monarch who was a great patron of the arts, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private performance, a theatrical approach to life that would, in the end, lead to his death. Gustav was a king who loved the stage, and his life was a kind of an ongoing drama. He was an actor, a playwright, and a poet, and he used the theatre as a way to promote his own image and his political agenda. His perversion, then, was a kind of a blurring of the lines between reality and art, a refusal to separate his public persona from his private life. He was a king who was always on stage, and his court was his audience. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was famously paranoid about being poisoned, and he would often have his food and drink tasted by a trusted servant before he would consume it. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was he truly paranoid, or was this just another part of his theatrical persona, a way to add a sense of drama and danger to his life? The debate is ongoing. His death was as theatrical as his life. He was assassinated at a masked ball in Stockholm, a setting that seems more at home in a Shakespearean play than in real life. The assassination was a political act, an attempt to kill a king who was seen as a tyrant by some members of the nobility. But the setting of the crime, a masquerade, adds a layer of surrealism and drama to the story. You can almost feel the chaos of the scene, the music and the dancing suddenly stopping as the king falls to the ground. The perversion of his reign was a kind of a public performance, a life that was lived as a work of art, with a tragic end that was more dramatic than any play he could have written. His legacy is one of cultural achievement and political failure, a reign that was a testament to how a king who is always acting can lose touch with the reality of his own life and the dangers that surround him. From the tragic stage of Gustav III's assassination, we now move southeast to the complicated and often scandalous history of Romania and its monarch, Carol II. You are in the early 20th century, a time of political upheaval and the decline of traditional monarchies. The air here is filled with the scent of old world charm and new world chaos. Carol II is a mainstream historical fact, a king who ruled for a short time and whose reign was marked by a seemingly endless series of personal scandals that were more dramatic than anything a Hollywood screenwriter could dream up. Carol's perversion was his profound inability to separate his personal desires from his royal duty. He was a man who seemed to deliberately seek out scandal and who, at every turn, chose love over his country. He was married to Princess Helen of Greece, and they had a son, Michael, who would later become king. But Carol was not interested in a traditional royal life. He was obsessed with a commoner, a woman named Magda Lupescu, and his relationship with her was a source of constant friction with the Romanian government and his family. His obsession with Magda Lupescu was a kind of a public and private scandal. He abdicated the throne once to marry her, and he was exiled from the country. When he returned and became king, he was still obsessed with her, and she became a powerful and influential figure at court, a fact that angered the Romanian elite. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Magda Lupescu was often called the Red Jezebel by the Romanian press, a sign of the deep and often misogynistic hatred that she inspired. Historians still argue whether she was a manipulative and power-hungry courtesan, or simply a woman who was in love with a king and who was unjustly scapegoated for his failures. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the frustration of the Romanian public and the political elite, watching their king throw away his throne and his reputation for a woman who was widely despised. His perversion was not a matter of carnal vice, but a kind of a deliberate and self-destructive refusal to act like a king. He was a man who seemed to deliberately court disaster, a kind of a living drama that was both fascinating and deeply destructive to his country. He was a king who was more concerned with his personal passions than with the fate of his nation. He was, in a sense, a perversion of a king, a man who had the title but none of the restraint or sense of duty that the position required. His legacy is one of political failure and personal scandal, a reign that was defined by a kind of a royal soap opera. From the tumultuous royal soap opera of Romania, we now travel to the island nation of Japan and the reign of Emperor Meiji. You are in the late 19th century, a time of profound and rapid change as Japan shed its feudal past and embraced the modern world. The air here is a strange mix of ancient tradition and new technology. Emperor Meiji is a mainstream historical fact, the man who oversaw the Meiji Restoration, a period of unprecedented modernization that transformed Japan into a global power. But his perversion was not in his personal desires, so much as in his use of them as a tool of statecraft. Emperor Meiji was a monarch who was, on the surface, a modern, Western-style ruler. He was the first Japanese emperor to wear Western clothes, and he was the face of Japan's modernization. But underneath the surface, he was a deeply traditional man, and his perversion was his adherence to the old ways. A practice that was a stark contrast to his public image. He was a polygamist, a fact that was a point of contention with his Western allies, but a deeply traditional practice in Japan. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that his wives and concubines were not just for pleasure, they were a political tool. The emperor had a great many children with his concubines, and these children were used to strengthen the bonds between the imperial family and the noble clans. His perversion, then, was not in his personal desires, but in his use of his personal life to serve the state. Historians still argue whether his polygamy was a sign of a traditionalist man who was resisting the modern world, or a clever political strategist who was using an old practice to serve a new purpose. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the tension in the royal court as the old ways and the new ways clashed. The emperor was a public symbol of a modern, forward-looking Japan, but his private life was a testament to the old world of imperial tradition. His perversion was a kind of a public and private hypocrisy, a man who was the face of modernization but who, in his personal life, was a traditionalist. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but who, in his private life, was a product of a feudal system. His legacy is one of political achievement and cultural transformation, but it is also one of profound personal and political contradictions. From the culturally complex court of Emperor Meiji, we now return to England, but to a much earlier and more brutal era. We land in the early 14th century and the reign of King Edward II. You are in a different England, one of stone castles and muddy roads, where the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and the simmering resentment of the nobility. Edward II is a mainstream historical fact, but his perversion was a kind of a public and political favoritism, a love for men that would, in the end, lead to his downfall and his death. Edward was a man who seemed more interested in the company of men than in the company of women. He had a great many male favourites, but two, in particular, were a source of constant scandal and political friction. The first was Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight who was the son of one of his father's courtiers. Edward showered him with titles, riches, and power, a fact that angered the traditional English nobility. His perversion, then, was not a matter of carnal vice, but a kind of a public and political favoritism that was seen as a perversion of a king's duty to rule fairly and to his own people. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Edward and Gaveston would often refer to each other by intimate nicknames, a kind of a public display of affection that was highly unusual for the time. Gaveston was known as the king's brother, a title that was a source of great offence to the nobles. Historians still argue whether Edward and Gaveston's relationship was a romantic one or a platonic one. The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the language of love and affection was different in the Middle Ages than it is today. You can almost feel the outrage of the English barons, watching their king spend his time and his money on a man who they saw as an upstart foreigner. They saw his relationship with Gaveston as a threat to their power and a perversion of a king's duty. The perversion was not just in his personal life, but in his political life, a kind of a blurring of the lines between love and power that was seen as a threat to the entire kingdom. After Gaveston's death at the hands of the angry barons, Edward found a new favourite in Hugh Despenser the Younger. Despenser was even more ambitious and ruthless than Gaveston, and his influence over the king was a source of even greater friction. Edward's obsession with Despenser was a kind of a self-destructive perversion, a refusal to learn from his past mistakes. His relationship with Despenser led to a full-blown civil war, and in the end, Edward was deposed and brutally murdered, a death that was as shocking as it was theatrical. The stories of his death, allegedly a red-hot poker inserted into his anus, are a testament to the hatred that he inspired. He was a king who was hated for his personal life and his political failures, a reign that was a tragic and brutal example of how a king's private desires can have devastating public consequences. From the brutal court of Edward II, We now jump forward to the dawn of the 20th century, to the German Empire on the eve of World War I. You are in a different Europe, one of grand empires and simmering tensions. The air here is formal and militaristic, but underneath the surface, a private scandal is about to erupt and rock the very foundations of the German monarchy. Our subject is Kaiser Wilhelm II, a mainstream historical fact, the last German emperor. But his perversion was a kind of a psychological and social failing, a profoundly public scandal that would be known as the Eulenburg Affair. The Eulenburg Affair was not a sex scandal in the traditional sense, but a scandal about male love and companionship. The affair centered on Wilhelm's closest friend, Prince Philipp von Eulenburg-Hertefeld, a diplomat and a key member of the Kaiser's inner circle. Wilhelm and his friends, a group of powerful and influential men, were a kind of a private club, a group of men who were bound by a shared sense of masculine friendship and, in some cases, a romantic or sexual attraction to each other. Their perversion was a kind of a private and social deviance from the rigid and heteronormative social norms of their time. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the men in this circle were known to exchange highly effusive and romantic letters with each other, referring to each other as my soul and my one and only love. The language was, by modern standards, a clear sign of a deep and emotional bond, but it was also a reflection of a kind of a romantic male friendship that was a holdover from the earlier centuries. Historians still argue whether the relationships within the Eulenburg circle were platonic or sexual. The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the scandal was a political one, orchestrated by the Kaiser's enemies, who used the rumors of homosexuality to bring down his powerful friend and to destabilize the German government. You can almost feel the shock of the German public and the political elite as the details of the scandal began to emerge. The newspapers were filled with lurid descriptions of the secret lives of the Kaiser's inner circle, and the trials that followed were a kind of a public spectacle. The perversion of this affair was not just in the private lives of the men involved, but in the way that it was used as a political weapon, a kind of a public and private hypocrisy that was a source of national shame. The scandal was a sign of a society that was on the brink of collapse, a world where the private lives of the powerful were a source of public and political instability. The Eulenburg Affair was a kind of a tragic, sad, and deeply personal drama that was played out on the world stage, a testament to how a king's private life can have devastating public consequences. It was a story of a scandal that was more than just a scandal. It was a sign of a world that was on the brink of war. From the repressed drama of the German court, we now travel to the gilded and exotic court of King Rama VI of Siam, modern-day Thailand. You are now in the early 20th century, a time of profound change as the Siamese monarchy, like the Japanese, struggled to modernize while maintaining its ancient traditions. The air here is thick with the scent of jasmine and the humid warmth of the tropics. Rama VI is a mainstream historical fact, the king who, like Emperor Meiji, oversaw a period of modernization, but whose perversion was a kind of a public and private theatricality, a love for the dramatic and the unconventional that was a source of great scandal. Rama VI was an intellectual and a writer, a man who had been educated in England and who, like Henry III of France, seemed to deliberately defy the expectations of a traditional monarch. He was married to a number of women, but he was known for his love of the theatre and his passion for male companionship. His perversion, then, was a kind of a public and private gender bending, a refusal to conform to the masculine ideal of a traditional Thai king. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he had a private group of male courtiers who he called his royal pages. They were a kind of a private club, a group of men who were his closest confidants and friends. They would often put on plays together, and Rama VI would write and direct them, and he would often cast himself in the lead role, often as a female character. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was his love of theatre and his male friends a sign of his homosexuality? Or was it a kind of a creative and intellectual outlet for a man who was confined by the traditions of his office? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the whispers of the royal court, watching their king put on plays and spend his time with his male pages. They saw it as a perversion of a king's duty, a kind of a public and private theatricality that was a source of great scandal. His reign was a short and controversial one. His love of the theatre and his unconventional personal life were a source of great friction with the traditional Thai elite, who saw him as too Western and too effeminate. He was a king who was a writer, a poet, and a playwright. But he was not a traditional monarch. His perversion was a kind of a blurring of the lines between art and life, a refusal to separate his public persona from his private passions. He was a kind of a living drama, a man who, in the end, seemed more interested in the stage than in the throne. His legacy is one of cultural achievement and political failure, a reign that was a testament to how a king who is always acting can lose touch with the reality of his own life and the duties that he has to his country. From the theatrical court of Rama VI, we now return to England, to the debauched and scandalous court of George IV. You're in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a time of grand excess and political upheaval. The air here is thick with the scent of expensive cigars, fine wines, and a general sense of decadence. George IV is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a patron of the arts and a lover of fine things, but whose perversion was a kind of public and private excess. A life lived with a kind of an unapologetic hedonism that was a source of constant scandal and political friction. George's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a public and private self-indulgence. He was famously overweight, a heavy drinker, and a profligate spender, and he seemed to deliberately defy the moral codes of his time. He was a kind of a living paradox. A man who was the king of a great and powerful nation, but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own pleasures than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic commoner. George was in love with her, and he secretly married her in a private ceremony, a marriage that was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was the marriage a sign of a deep, emotional love? Or was it just another example of a king who believed he was above the law? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the whispers of the English elite, watching their future king marry a Catholic commoner in secret. They saw it as a perversion of a king's duty, a kind of a public and private hypocrisy that was a source of great scandal. His reign was a short and controversial one. His debauched lifestyle and his frequent political blunders were a source of constant friction with the English government and his own family. He was a king who was hated for his personal life and his political failures, a reign that was a tragic and brutal example of how a king's private desires can have devastating public consequences. He was a kind of a living symbol of a monarchy that had lost its way, a man who was more interested in his own pleasures than in the fate of his nation. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the decadent court of George IV, we now travel to the heart of the Ottoman Empire, to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and the vast, secretive world of Suleiman the Magnificent's harem. You are in the 16th century, a time of grand empires and absolute power, and the air here is thick with the scent of spices and a quiet, profound tension. Suleiman is a mainstream historical fact, the sultan who presided over the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, but his perversion was not in his personal desires, so much as in his use of a private, social institution for public and political ends. The harem, a word that literally means forbidden place, was not just a place for the sultan's wives and concubines, it was a complex, hierarchical system that was a microcosm of the empire itself. The women of the harem were not just sexual objects, they were often powerful and influential figures. And the perversion was the way this private, domestic space was used as a tool of statecraft. The women of the harem, from the mothers of the sultan's children to the most humble concubine, were all part of a system that was designed to serve the sultan and the state. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the story of Roxolana, a Slavic concubine who rose through the ranks of the harem to become Suleiman's legal wife, a move that was a profound break with Ottoman tradition. She was a politically shrewd and influential woman, and she used her position to influence the sultan's decisions and to advance her own children. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was Roxolana a cunning and manipulative woman who used her beauty to gain power, or was she simply a brilliant woman who was making the most of a system that was designed to keep her powerless? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the harem, the way the women would have vied for the Sultan's attention, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their children depended on their ability to please him. The harem was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a woman's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the Sultan. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The harem was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. It was a world of beauty and intrigue, a place where the private lives of the powerful were a source of public and political instability. From the secretive world of the Ottoman harem, we now travel to the gilded and glamorous court of the Habsburg Empire. In late 19th century Vienna, you are in a different Europe, one of grand balls, a thriving opera scene, and a sense of old-world charm that is about to disappear forever. The air here is thick with the scent of cigars, perfume, and a quiet sense of decadence. Our subject is Archduke Otto of Austria, a mainstream historical fact, the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph I, but whose perversion was a kind of a public and private hedonism. A life lived with a kind of an unapologetic self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal and embarrassment to his family. Archduke Otto, the father of the last Habsburg emperor, was not a king, but he was a member of one of the most powerful and conservative royal families in Europe. His perversion, then, was a kind of a public and private rebellion against the rigid and formal expectations of his family. He was a man who seemed to deliberately seek out scandal and who, at every turn, chose pleasure over his duty to his family. He was known for his love of drink, his many mistresses, and his general disregard for the social and moral codes of his time. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world, but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own pleasures than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was famously nicknamed Gassenschönheit, which translates to street beauty, a term that was used to refer to his love for partying in the red light districts of Vienna. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was his love for the street beauty a sign of a kind of a democratic spirit, a man who was interested in the lives of ordinary people? Or was it just another example of a man who was a slave to his own appetites? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the frustration of the Emperor Franz Joseph, a man who was a symbol of duty and tradition, watching his nephew, the heir to the throne, embarrass the family with his public and private scandals. The perversion of his life was not a single act of cruelty or a hidden vice, but a kind of a deliberate and self-destructive refusal to act like a member of a royal family. He was a man who seemed to deliberately court disaster, a kind of a living drama that was both fascinating and deeply destructive to his family. He was a man who was more concerned with his own passions than with the fate of his empire. He was, in a sense, a perversion of a royal, a man who had the title but none of the restraint or sense of duty that the position required. His legacy is one of personal failure and public scandal, a life that was a testament to how a man who is a slave to his own appetites can bring shame and embarrassment to his family and his empire. From the hedonistic and scandalous court of Archduke Otto, we now travel to the arid, sun-baked landscape of Egypt and the short but extravagant reign of King Farouk. You are now in the mid-20th century, a time of political instability and the final days of colonial rule. The air here is hot and dry, but it's filled with a quiet sense of foreboding, a sense of a world on the brink of profound change. Farouk is a mainstream historical fact, the last king of Egypt, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private gluttony, a life lived with a kind of an unapologetic self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Farouk's perversion was not just about sex or power, it was about an obsession with consumption, a kind of a public and private self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal. He was a man who seemed to deliberately defy the moral and social codes of his time, and who, at every turn, chose pleasure over his duty to his country. He was famously overweight, a heavy drinker, and a profligate spender, and he seemed to deliberately defy the norms of a traditional monarch. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the king of a great and powerful nation but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a compulsive thief, and he would often steal things from his guests, a kind of a bizarre and petty crime that was a source of constant embarrassment to his family and his government. He famously stole Winston Churchill's watch, a fact that was a source of great diplomatic friction. Historians still argue whether his thievery was a sign of a profound psychological instability or just another example of a man who believed he was above the law. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the shame of the Egyptian public and the political elite, watching their king spend his time on lavish parties, gambling, and a seemingly endless series of women. He was a man who seemed to be living in a world of his own creation, a romantic tragedy where he was the star. His love life, far from being a private matter, was a public spectacle and a source of national shame. He was a king who ruled with a kind of a charming roguishness, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the decadent court of King Farouk, we now travel to the exotic and private world of the Persian court in the late 19th century and the reign of Nasser al-Din Shah Qajar. You are in a different world, one of intricate carpets, grand palaces, and a sense of absolute, unchallenged power. The air here is thick with the scent of rosewater and a quiet, profound sense of intrigue. Nasser al-Din Shah is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a patron of the arts and a lover of science, but whose perversion was a kind of a private and public voyeurism, a love for the camera that would transform his harem and his court into a kind of a living, breathing photography studio. Nasser al-Din Shah was a king who was fascinated by the new technology of photography. He was one of the first monarchs in the world to be an avid photographer, and he used his camera to document his life, his travels, and his court. His perversion, then, was not just in his sexual desires, but in his use of his camera to document and, in a sense, to possess the women of his harem. He would often pose them in strange and unconventional ways, and he would often keep the photos for his own private collection. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was particularly obsessed with the women of his harem, and he would often photograph them in the nude or in revealing clothing. He was also fascinated by the women of the Caucasus, and he would often have them pose in traditional clothing, a kind of a bizarre and fetishistic obsession with a foreign culture. Historians still argue whether his photography was a sign of a truly artistic spirit or a kind of a voyeuristic and perverted obsession. The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the photos he took are the only surviving record of the lives of the women of his harem. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the harem, the way the women would have had to pose for the king, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their children depended on their ability to please him. The harem was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a woman's life could be transformed by a single photograph. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The harem was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. It was a world of beauty and intrigue, a place where the private lives of the powerful were a source of public and political instability. His legacy is one of cultural achievement and political failure, a reign that was a testament to how a man who is a slave to his own appetites can bring shame and embarrassment to his family and his empire. From the private, voyeuristic court of Persia, we now return to France, but to the Renaissance court of François I. You are in the early 16th century, a time of grand artistic and intellectual awakening, and the air here is thick with the scent of ambition and intrigue. The court of François I is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a patron of the arts and a rival of Henry VIII, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private libertinism, a love for women that would define his court and his reign. François III was a king who loved women, and he was known for his many mistresses and his love for the ladies of the court. His perversion, then, was not a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a public and private obsession with women, a kind of a worship of the female form that was both a source of scandal and a source of power. He created a court where women held significant power and influence, and he would often consult with them on matters of state. His court was a kind of a paradise for women, a place where they could express themselves and their ideas. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that his favourite mistress, the Duchess of Étampes, was a woman of great intelligence and influence. She was a kind of a power behind the throne, and she used her position to advance her own family and her own political agenda. Historians still argue whether his love for women was a sign of a truly egalitarian spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a king who used his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the women would have vied for the king's attention, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a woman's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how a king's personal life, even in the most public of spaces, can be a source of immense power and political instability. His legacy is one of cultural achievement and political cunning, a reign that was a testament to how a king can use his personal life to serve his political agenda. From the libertine court of Francois I, we now travel to the hermetic and deeply troubled court of King Yonsangun of Joseon dynasty Korea. You are in the late 15th century, a time of profound Confucian ritual and social hierarchy, and the air here is thick with a quiet, simmering fear. Yonsangun is a mainstream historical fact, a king who was hated for his cruelty and his tyrannical rule, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private sadism, a life lived with a kind of an unapologetic self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Yonsangun's perversion wasn't just about his sexual desires, it was about a profound and perverse cruelty. He was a king who was known for his love of torture, and he would often have his enemies and their families brutally executed, and he would often force his courtiers to participate in his cruel games. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the king of a great and powerful nation, but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was known for his obsession with a particular kind of sadism. He would often have his concubines and his courtesans participate in strange and unconventional sexual acts, and he would often force them to perform for him in a kind of a grotesque and theatrical way. Historians still argue whether his cruelty was a sign of a profound psychological instability or just another example of a man who believed he was above the law. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the brutal court of King Yonsangun, we now travel to the gilded and exotic court of the Mughal Empire in India and the reign of Emperor Jahangir. You are in the early 17th century, a time of grand artistic and intellectual awakening, and the air here is thick with the scent of spices and a quiet, profound sense of intrigue. Jahangir is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a patron of the arts and a lover of fine things, but whose perversion was a kind of a public and private addiction, a life lived with a kind of an unapologetic self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Jahangir's perversion wasn't just about his sexual desires, it was about his profound and public addiction to alcohol and opium. He was a man who seemed to deliberately defy the Islamic prohibition on alcohol, and he would often get drunk in public, a fact that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the emperor of a great and powerful nation, but who, in his personal life seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a devoted husband to his wife, Nur Jahan, a woman who was a powerful and influential figure in her own right. She was a kind of a power behind the throne, and she used her position to advance her own family and her own political agenda. Historians still argue whether his love for Nur Jahan was a sign of a truly egalitarian spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a king who used his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people. And that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the opium-fueled court of Emperor Jahangir, we now return to France. But to the early 17th century and the reign of Louis XIII, you are in a different France, one of political turmoil and religious wars. And the air here is thick with a quiet, profound sense of intrigue. Louis XIII is a mainstream historical fact. The king who, with his chief minister Cardinal Richelieu, consolidated power and laid the groundwork for the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. But his perversion was a kind of a psychological and social failing, a profound inability to engage in traditional relationships and a love for men that was a source of constant scandal and political friction. Louis XIII was a king who was, by all accounts, a deeply troubled and insecure man. He was married to Anne of Austria, a Spanish princess, but their marriage was a disaster, and they had a famously difficult relationship. His perversion, then, was a kind of a public and private retreat from the traditional royal family life. Instead of a loving relationship with his wife, he found solace and comfort in the company of men. He had a great many male confidants, but one, in particular, was a source of constant scandal and political friction, the Marquis de Cinq-Mars. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Louis XIII and Cinq-Mars would often share a bed together, a fact that was a source of constant speculation and gossip at court. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was their relationship a sexual one, or was it a kind of a platonic, almost fraternal bond? The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the language of love and affection was different in the 17th century than it is today. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the troubled court of Louis XIII, we now travel to 18th century Sweden and the intellectual but scandalous court of Queen Louisa Ulrika. You are in a different Sweden, one that is grappling with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the limitations of an absolute monarchy. The air here is a strange mix of intellectual ferment and royal intrigue. Louisa Ulrika is a mainstream historical fact, the sister of Frederick the Great of Prussia. But her perversion was a kind of a public and private intellectualism, a love for the dramatic and the unconventional that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Louisa Ulrika was a woman of great intelligence and ambition, and she was a patron of the arts and a lover of science. She created a court that was a hub of intellectual life, a northern Athens, where she would host philosophers and artists from all over Europe. But her perversion was a kind of a public and private intellectualism, a refusal to conform to the traditional role of a queen as a simple figurehead. She was a woman who was a political player in her own right. And she used her court as a kind of a political salon, a place where she could debate and discuss the ideas of the Enlightenment. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that she was an avid collector of art and a lover of science, and she would often conduct her own scientific experiments, a kind of a bizarre and unconventional hobby for a queen. Historians still argue whether her intellectualism was a sign of a truly enlightened spirit, a woman who was ahead of her time, or just another example of a woman who was using her personal life to serve her political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the queen's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please her. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. She was a queen who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. She was a queen who was more concerned with her own desires than with the needs of her people, and that, in the end, was her greatest perversion. From the intellectual court of Louisa Ulrica, we now return to France, but to a different era entirely. The mid-16th century and the reign of Henri II. You are now in a France that is a rival to Henry VIII's England, and the air here is thick with a quiet, profound sense of intrigue. Henri II is a mainstream historical fact. The king who was a warrior and a patron of the arts, but whose perversion was a kind of a public and private obsession with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman who was 20 years older than him. His public and private devotion to her was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Henri's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a public and private obsession with a woman who was a source of constant scandal. He was married to Catherine de' Medici, a woman who was a powerful and influential figure in her own right, but he was famously in love with Diane, and he would often give her gifts and titles that rightfully belonged to his wife. His perversion, then, was a kind of a public and private disrespect for his wife and his royal duty. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Henri II and Diane de Poitiers had a famous and public rivalry with Catherine de' Medici, who was a kind of a political and social rival to Diane. The two women would often compete for the king's attention, and their rivalry was a source of constant gossip and political friction at court. Historians still argue whether Henri's love for Diane was a sign of a truly romantic spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a king who used his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the obsessive court of Henri II, we travel north to the small but influential kingdom of Denmark and the reign of Frederick III. You are in the 17th century, a time of grand political strategy and brutal warfare. The air here is sharp, cold, and smells of discipline and pipe smoke. Frederick III is a mainstream historical fact, the king who, with the help of his chief minister, consolidated power and laid the groundwork for an absolute monarchy, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private fascination with the bizarre. a love for the theatrical and the unconventional that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Frederick's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a public and private obsession with the strange and the unconventional. He was famously fascinated by dwarfs, and he would often have them brought to his court, a fact that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the king of a great and powerful nation but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he had a personal dwarf named Christian, who he would often have accompany him on his travels and who he would often use as a kind of a living, breathing doll. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was his fascination with dwarfs a sign of a profound psychological instability, or just another example of a man who believed he was above the law? The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the strange, miniature court of Frederick III, we now return to the heart of the Catholic world, the Vatican, and the corrupt papacy of Pope Sixtus IV. You are in late 15th century Rome, a place of immense political power and spiritual authority, but also one of profound corruption and moral decay. The air here is thick with the scent of incense and the stink of backroom deals. Our subject, a mainstream historical fact, is a pope whose perversion was a kind of a public and private nepotism, a love for his family that would corrupt the very institution of the papacy and would lead to a period of unprecedented scandal. Sixtus IV was a man who, like Pope Alexander VI, seemed to have no regard for the sacred vows of his office. His perversion was not in his sexual desires so much as in his relentless and unapologetic promotion of his nephews. He had a great many nephews, and he would often give them titles, riches, and power, a fact that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the head of the Catholic Church but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in the fortunes of his family than in the salvation of souls. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a patron of the arts and a lover of science, and he was the man who was responsible for the construction of the Sistine Chapel, a fact that is a profound and unsettling juxtaposition of his spiritual and his personal failings. Historians still argue whether his artistic patronage was a sign of a truly enlightened spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a man who was using his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the cardinals and the bishops would have had to navigate the Pope's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the Pope. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The papacy was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most spiritual of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a pope who was more concerned with the fortunes of his family than with the salvation of souls. And that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the corrupt papacy of Sixtus IV, we now journey back to Russia, to the brutal and terrifying reign of Ivan IV, a ruler who would come to be known as the Terrible. You are in the mid-16th century, a time of grand political upheaval and the consolidation of Russian power. The air here is thick with a quiet, profound fear. Ivan the Terrible is a mainstream historical fact, the first Tsar of Russia, but his perversion was a kind of a public and private sadism, a life lived with a kind of an unapologetic self-indulgence that was a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. Ivan's perversion wasn't just about his sexual desires, it was about his profound and perverse cruelty. He was a man who was known for his love of torture, and he would often have his enemies and their families brutally executed, and he would often force his courtiers to participate in his cruel games. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the Tsar of a great and powerful nation, but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a devoutly religious man, and he would often spend hours in prayer and contemplation, a fact that is a profound and unsettling juxtaposition of his spiritual and his personal failings. Historians still argue whether his cruelty was a sign of a profound psychological instability or just another example of a man who believed he was above the law. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the Tsar's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a Tsar who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a Tsar who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the brutal court of Ivan the Terrible, we now travel to the seemingly demure and prudish court of Queen Victoria. You are now in the mid-19th century, a time of grand empire and profound social change. The air here is thick with a quiet sense of moral rectitude and a public sense of decorum. Victoria is a mainstream historical fact. The Queen who was a symbol of her age, a woman who gave her name to a period of history known for its rigid moral codes and its profound sense of public duty. But her perversion was not in her public life, it was in her private one. A kind of a profound and hidden passion that stood in stark contrast to her public image. Victoria's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a profound and private sensuality. She was famously in love with her husband, Prince Albert, and their marriage was a source of great personal and public joy. But after his death, she became a recluse, a woman who was in mourning for the rest of her life. Her perversion, then, was a kind of a public and private hypocrisy, a woman who was a symbol of moral rectitude, but who, in her private life, was a deeply emotional and passionate woman. She had a great many passions, but two, in particular, were a source of constant scandal and a profound national embarrassment. The first was her intense and public love for her servant, John Brown. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that she would often have John Brown accompany her on her travels, and she would often give him gifts and titles that were a source of great offence to the English nobility. This is a point that historians still argue about. Was her relationship with John Brown a romantic one or a platonic one? The debate is ongoing, and it's complicated by the fact that the language of love and affection was different in the 19th century than it is today. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the Queen's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please her. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the Queen. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. She was a queen who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. She was a queen who was more concerned with her own desires than with the needs of her people. And that, in the end, was her greatest perversion. From the private passions of Queen Victoria, we now travel to the grandeur of the Tang dynasty in China and the reign of Emperor Taizong. You are now in the 7th century. a time of grand empire and profound social change. The air here is thick with a quiet sense of moral rectitude and a public sense of decorum. Taizong is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a symbol of his age, a man who gave his name to a period of history known for its rigid moral codes and its profound sense of public duty. But his perversion was not in his public life, it was in his private one, a kind of a profound and hidden passion that stood in stark contrast to his public image. Taizong's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a profound and private sensuality. He was a man who, like Emperor Meiji of Japan, was a public symbol of a modern, forward-looking China, but whose private life was a testament to the old world of imperial tradition. He was a polygamist, a fact that was a point of contention with his Western allies, but a deeply traditional practice in China. He had a great many wives and concubines, and he would often use them as a way to strengthen the bonds between the imperial family and the noble clans. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a devoted husband to his wife, Empress Jiang Sun, a woman who was a powerful and influential figure in her own right. She was a kind of a power behind the throne, and she used her position to advance her own family and her own political agenda. Historians still argue whether his love for Empress Jiangsun was a sign of a truly egalitarian spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a king who used his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the harmonious, yet complex, court of Emperor Taizong, we now travel to the gilded and exotic court of the Mughal Empire in India, and the reign of Emperor Akbar the Great. You are in the 16th century, a time of grand empire and profound social change. The air here is thick with a quiet sense of moral rectitude and a public sense of decorum. Akbar is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a symbol of his age, a man who gave his name to a period of history known for its rigid moral codes and its profound sense of public duty. But his perversion was not in his public life, it was in his private one, a kind of a profound and hidden passion that stood in stark contrast to his public image. Akbar's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a profound and private sensuality. He was a man who, like Emperor Meiji of Japan, was a public symbol of a modern, forward-looking India, but whose private life was a testament to the old world of imperial tradition. He was a polygamist, a fact that was a point of contention with his Western allies, but a deeply traditional practice in India. He had a great many wives and concubines, and he would often use them as a way to strengthen the bonds between the imperial family and the noble clans. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a devoted husband to his wife, Joda Bai, a woman who was a powerful and influential figure in her own right. She was a kind of a power behind the throne, and she used her position to advance her own family and her own political agenda. Historians still argue whether his love for Joda Bai was a sign of a truly egalitarian spirit, a man who was ahead of his time, or just another example of a king who used his personal life to serve his political agenda. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people. And that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. From the enlightened yet polygamous court of Akbar the Great, we now return to the gilded and glamorous world of late 19th and early 20th century Britain and the reign of Edward VII. You are now in a world of grand empires, social change, and the final days of the Victorian era. The air here is thick with a quiet sense of moral rectitude and a public sense of decorum. But underneath the surface, a private scandal is about to erupt and rock the very foundations of the British monarchy. Edward VII is a mainstream historical fact, the king who was a symbol of his age, a man who gave his name to a period of history known for its rigid moral codes and its profound sense of public duty. But his perversion was not in his public life, it was in his private one, a kind of a profound and hidden passion that stood in stark contrast to his public image. Edward's perversion wasn't a matter of sexual deviance in the traditional sense, but a kind of a profound and private sensuality. He was married to Princess Alexandra of Denmark, a woman who, by all accounts, was a kind and intelligent queen, but he was a man who seemed to deliberately seek out scandal and who, at every turn, chose pleasure over his duty to his country. He was famously overweight, a heavy drinker, and a profligate spender, and he seemed to deliberately defy the moral codes of his time. He was, in a sense, a kind of a living paradox, a man who was the king of a great and powerful nation, but who, in his personal life, seemed to be more interested in his own appetites than in his royal duties. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that he was a devoted husband to his wife, but he had a great many mistresses, and he would often keep them in a kind of a separate, private world. He was a man who was a patron of the arts and a lover of fine things, but whose perversion was a kind of a public and private hypocrisy. A man who was a symbol of moral rectitude, but who, in his private life, was a deeply emotional and passionate man. Historians still argue whether his many affairs were a sign of a profound psychological instability or just another example of a man who believed he was above the law. The debate is ongoing. You can almost feel the quiet, profound tension of the court, the way the courtiers would have had to navigate the king's unpredictable and often violent moods, knowing that their fortunes and the fortunes of their families depended on their ability to please him. The court was a place of immense beauty and immense cruelty, a place where a person's life could be transformed by a single encounter with the king. The perversion was not in the sexual acts themselves, but in the way that the system used human desires and human lives as a political tool. The court was a kind of a living, breathing testament to how absolute power, even in the most private of spaces, can corrupt absolutely. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but whose heart was lost in a bizarre and macabre fantasy. He was a king who was more concerned with his own desires than with the needs of his people, and that, in the end, was his greatest perversion. And now, as we reach the end of our long and winding road through the history of royal perversion, it's time to bring our journey to a close. Let's let the sounds of the past fade away, the whispers of the courts and the clinking of goblets becoming nothing more than a soft, distant echo. You can feel the weight of all these stories, a heavy blanket of strange and unsettling facts, but don't let them keep you up. The world of kings and queens, of power and perversion, is a world we can now safely leave behind. Let your mind clear, let the images soften, and let the quiet hum of the night take over. The drama is over, the curtains are drawn, and all the scandalous secrets are now just a part of the long, strange river of history. Let your breathing become slow and steady, a gentle rhythm that lulls you deeper into a peaceful quiet. The history books are now closed, the pages settled, and all that's left is the soft sound of you, drifting off. End of script. Sweet dreams.